Since we first took to the skies, pilots have faced bad weather, and sadly not all of them have come through unscathed. So in this program we'll look at how to deal with the problem. We'll talk to professionals from around Australia, including chief flying instructors, meteorologists and investigators. You'll learn why pilots should plan thoroughly and make timely decisions. So what happens when a pilot enters cloud? According to aviation medical expert Dr. David Newman, it doesn't take much to lose your bearings.
Well, normally we orientate ourselves in space by reference to the horizon, a visible horizon, and the force of gravity, which is 1g on the surface of the Earth. Now, when you go flying, of course, you can get into a situation where the horizon is not clearly visible, and of course, if you manoeuvre the aeroplane, you can get more than 1g. So we can alter our natural references very easily in the aviation environment. Now, if you lose visual reference outside the aircraft, then 80% of your orientation information has gone. Visually based cues are responsible for most of our orientation information. Now, the remaining 20% is split equally between the inner ear balance mechanisms and what we call the seat of the pants, the proprioceptive system. So those two systems alone without visual cues are not that accurate, and it's quite easy in IMC conditions to become disorientated.
Why would anyone fly into cloud? The ATSB has released a report about pilot behaviour in the face of adverse weather. Let's hear about it.
As we describe in the report, basically weather-related decision making isn't a one-off static decision, it's really a dynamic ongoing process. And what I mean by that is that during a flight, a pilot will have to continually make a series of related decisions about the weather. And they might make 4 or 5 good decisions in a row. They might initially take off and then turn back. Then later they might try a second time, they might go part of the way, they might divert. But again, at each point, the flight is only safe as that last decision that the pilot makes. So in a way, you know, you'd like to think that you get a bit of credit. You made 5 good decisions, you get a bit of credit, and you're not judged so harshly on the next decision. But, you know, unfortunately it doesn't work like that, does it? So it's that idea of always being continually mindful of the situations, looking and planning ahead and continuing to make good decisions.
As you can see, good decisions are essential, but they must begin at the planning stage. Proper flight planning reduces pilot stress and increases safety margins.
I think it's very important that before a flight commences, and probably even before the planning commences for a flight, that the interested parties, if you like, should sit down and discuss what the no-go situations are.
Best advice is do your preparation. Collect all your metadata. Look at the Bureau of Met site through NAPE, submit your flight plan, plan your trip as carefully as you can, doing as much homework as you can, planning by the safest route and not the most direct route.
Using things like the Bureau of Meteorology website, Air Services Australia, local knowledge by calling people along the route.
A lot of aerodromes now have automated systems whereby they're actually giving you reports. Study the reports, talk to someone at your destination, maybe the CFO of the flying school.
Do you know how to interpret a TAF? The Bureau of Meteorology website has a fantastic e-learning section. There's a weather decoder for all your TAFs and METARs.
All of the products that we send out, which includes the observations, warnings, forecasts, and forecasts include the area forecasts for general flying, the TAFs, so for landing and taking off, those sorts of things, as well as airport warnings, SIG weather charts, anything you could possibly need for planning and preparing for a flight can be found on the Bureau's website.
Weather does change. There seems to be, and it's not just in aviation, it's in all areas. We often get people that get the forecast for next weekend on Monday and assume that it's going to be the same. The weather does change, and it can change quite rapidly. So most of the products that we do are issued routinely every 6 hours to take account of that change, and of course updated in between those 6 hours if necessary.
It's also good for pilots to keep a good weather outlook for what's happening. I know a lot of pilots generally don't fly every day of the week, but it's always a good policy to tune into the evening weather services on the television stations. Gives you where you get a satellite image and the surface weather chart, and with time looking at those and looking at the weather, what's happening the next day, you'll build up a feel for what weather situations create what conditions, and what situations in particular create conditions where visual flight rules do not apply.
There's only so much information we can put into a TAF or an area forecast. If pilots are a little bit uncertain about conditions or want a specific wind forecast for a certain flight, or just really want to know a little bit more information or any uncertainties that might appear in the forecast, they are more than welcome to ring the forecaster directly.
You've covered all your bases. Your planning's included weather, fuel, alternates and safe altitudes. You've briefed the passengers and decide to go. Once airborne though, you have to remain vigilant and be prepared to make decisions early.
When you come to the conclusion that the weather is not as good as you thought it was and that you're not going to be able to get through, then now is the time to make a decision, and the decision is best made early. It's no good leaving it to the last possible moment and saying, oh, I'm going to keep on pressing on and maybe I'll get there, maybe I will, and then in the end you find you're in cloud, and then that's not a happy place to be if you're a VFR pilot.
A great decision-making tool to have as a day VFR pilot is to have considered your lowest safe altitude for the route that you're about to take. I suggest that you just run along 10 nautical miles either side of your track and add on 500 feet to the highest terrain. This becomes your lowest safe altitude. In flight, if you're not going to be able to continue seeing the horizon at this altitude, that's the point at which you need to make a decision of either diverting or returning back to base.
Safest group, that's the pilots that took some sort of proactive weather avoidance action, took that action in the first half of the flight. In actual fact, often took it quite near their point of departure, so they might have taken off and then realised that the weather wasn't perhaps as good as it was forecast, or that they were heading towards adverse weather, and so they've made a decision perhaps to return to the aerodrome that they departed from. And in contrast, the VFR and IMC group, those occurrences occurred far later in the second half of the flight and often quite near the destination. Pressure for pilots as they get close to their destination to sort of press on and think, look, I'm almost there, if I just keep going I can probably get through. Whereas in that case they're probably better, if things really have deteriorated to quite an extent, to carry out a precautionary landing.
Above all, it is not closing the back door, not closing a side door, and if little voices inside you are telling that it's not a good situation, then when in doubt, turn about. It's the push-on-itis that will end up putting you into jeopardy.
Making the decision early is the important thing. Most of these things occur because we don't make a hard decision. We don't make the decision to turn and land at an airfield that's in the clear simply because it's not the destination. We always want to get back. That's where our family is, or it's where our car is. It's the familiar place, whereas if you have to make the decision to go to another airfield, there's all these complications when you get on the ground as to how do I get the aeroplane back, where will I stay, etc. But they're sort of complications that are easy to fix on the ground.
Is VFR pilots tend to push on. 5Ks is a very little distance, and a good judge is if you're sitting in the aeroplane, flying the aeroplane, and you're actually having to look out the window on the side to see where you are instead of looking forward, and the forward visibility you got is no longer any good, and you should consider turning around or diverting to where there's better weather.
A lot of the time people get into cloud when they didn't mean to is they didn't make a decision and all of a sudden they're in it. Again, we need to give them practice in this defensive idea that could I get through there? What could go wrong? Have I got an escape route? It's okay to turn around, it's okay to consider that I won't make my destination.
If it's a VFR pilot who's trying to fly somewhere and there's a deteriorating weather situation in front of them, that's going to concentrate their attention to an extent. As they approach the bad weather or even enter the bad weather, they're likely to experience a stress reaction to this event. Heart rate will go up, their blood pressure is going to increase, they'll start to sweat, they'll start to become quite concerned about their situation. Now this can affect their decision-making process. As their stress reaction goes up, their ability to make a clear, rational decision may become impaired. At that point, it's quite dangerous because the pilot may not make a clear, accurate decision to turn around and go back out of the bad weather.
You're in the air, but you have some concern about whether you can remain visual. It's simple. Talk to air traffic control, and if you get into cloud, they can be a lifeline.
On average, around once every 10 days, a pilot declares an emergency. And that equates to around about 60% of them are basically on top of cloud, where they can't get down through it, and the rest are basically through either in cloud or reduced visibility through things like smoke and fog and things like that. Luckily for us, most of them get away with it with the help of air traffic control, and these are also only the reported occurrences as well.
The best emergency is the one that doesn't occur, and if there's any doubt or whatever, ask for assistance. We're there to help, and if we can, we will, and we'd rather prevent it becoming a full-blown emergency than actually have a full-blown emergency.
Air services and the military, we operate off the same document, so we do air traffic control the same way. So from a pilot's point of view, it should be seamless. So whether or not you're flying into a military controlled aerodrome or a civilly controlled aerodrome, the procedures are exactly the same.
The first thing to do, the controller will try and ensure that the pilot's flying the aeroplane, like if it's in cloud, monitoring instruments, etc., and we'll try and ascertain from the pilot how much instrument flying time they've had, look at things like if the airplane's got an autopilot and whether the pilot's able to use it to help assist flying the aeroplane. That's the first thing we need to sort out. Then we'll use other pilot or other aircraft around the place, Bureau of Met and other information that we can get hold of to try and find out where other VMC conditions are, such as if you're on top looking for holes in the cloud base. If they're in IMC, it will be looking at sort of where that we could navigate the aircraft to. We may ask the pilot questions as well about when was the last time it was in VMC, etc., because it may be the closest place is actually to go back on, sort of do a reciprocal track to where they were. So the first point is to try and ascertain the situation, and then we'll use all variety of different sources to obtain or work out where the best place is to help the aircraft get to.
If you happen to find yourself in trouble or looking at diminishing options when it comes to weather, please don't hesitate to call. There are all sorts of air traffic services out there. You don't have to be in a controlled environment like a military aerodrome. You can be OCTA and still be able to get FlightWatch and other control agencies on HF and VHF. They're all there to help, and yeah, you're not alone out there, so make sure you speak up if you're likely to get into trouble.
Once you're in cloud, things can quickly go wrong. It could help if you have instrument experience, but remember, it takes instrument-rated pilots more than 40 hours to become proficient, so it will take you more than a little luck to survive.
First thing you've got to do is stay calm, stay on your instruments. Your instruments won't lie to you. Stay on the artificial horizon, maintain wings level. Then get on the radio and ask for help through the relevant ATC section. If you have someone beside you, get them to help you as well. Use air traffic control as basically your co-pilot where necessary.
A pilot entering IMC may go into a turn that they don't recognise, and this can occur for many reasons. One wing may drop some degrees, the pilot may be preoccupied in the cockpit with trying to work out what's going on, may not recognise that the wing's dropped and it's gone into a turn. Now the balance mechanisms in the inner ear have a threshold below which they won't pick up any motion. Now that can occur when a pilot goes into this one wing low type situation. If the pilot then recognises that they're in a turn and recovers, that recovery is likely to be quite quick, and the inner ear mechanisms will then get some input that they're turning. And that can create a mismatch between what the pilot feels in their balance system compared with what the instruments of the aircraft are telling them. Now that inner ear mechanism can give very strong impulses to a pilot, to the extent that in some cases the instruments will be ignored and the pilot will simply follow what their head is telling them. Now that can clearly result in a significant spatial disorientation event. Now pilots need to look at the instruments and make the instruments read correct, straight and level, and try to ignore the sensations that their head is giving them. That can be very difficult because the sensations can be very strong, but clearly it's important to believe the instruments rather than what the pilot's head is telling them. Other factors can make disorientation more likely. What the pilot's been doing in the 1 or 2 days prior to flight can have an important effect on the risk of disorientation. Alcohol can make disorientation more likely. Even the hangover effect can make it more likely. That's also going to interfere with the pilot's decision-making abilities and overall flight performance. Any medications the pilot may be taking for whatever reason can interfere with their inner-ear balance mechanisms, the decision-making process, and of course the reason they're taking the medication. If it's an illness for whatever reason, so even a simple one like a cold or some respiratory tract infection can impair not only their overall flight performance but their risk of disorientation.
One of the big things that pilots don't do is they don't slow their aeroplane down. That is very important. When you get into bad weather, the cloud base is lowering, the visibility is decreasing, put the aeroplane in the precautionary mode. Every aeroplane has a precautionary mode, usually a couple of stages of flap, slower speed, and this gives you time to think. This also decreases your radius of turn when you turn the aircraft. So slow the aeroplane down. Get away from the cloud, slow the aeroplane down.
Basically, sub-regulation 4 of Regulation 157 gives you an out for not being permitted to fly below 500 feet or 1,000 feet over towns. And that is that it says, through stress of weather, you may descend to a lower altitude if it's essential for the safety of the aircraft. And essential means that there's really no other safety option available to you. In other words, if you don't do this, then there's great risk to the aeroplane and to yourself.
Most people learn to fly in blue skies, but it's worth experiencing bad weather. So, go on a flight with an instructor and experience marginal conditions. This will help you in the future to make decisions that could save your life.
The best thing we can do is, we try to encourage people to continue their training. Most of them, once they have their basic ready, they do an aerobatics rating afterwards or a night rating. And by that time, maybe the weather will change a little bit and things like that. Or we encourage people to come back and maybe do a backseat with somebody when the weather is a bit different as well, so they get the real exposure to the weather, really,
But I think the biggest thing we can do is give people practical experience of what it's like, so they can see it coming for themselves. And rather than it being a theoretical, abstract thing that they've talked about and read about, but it will never really happen to them, they are put in the situation and realise what it's like, and will either then decide themselves that it could happen to them and they'll get instrument rated, or at least they've been put in the situation with an instructor and they'll see it coming and hopefully be prepared next time to turn around before it's too late.
So a little bit of common knowledge, a little bit of reading. Read Flight Safety Magazine, there's some excellent examples in there. People getting caught out, and learn from their mistakes and learn from your own mistakes.
So there you have it. If you're unsure about whether to fly, don't go. But if you're well prepared and proactive, you'll have less stress and greater safety. And make sure you look at the rest of the DVD, as it covers 8 specific locations around Australia and is a wealth of information.
We have the wet season and the dry season. The wet season runs from around about October, November through to about April, and then the dry season is from April through to about October. They're two quite distinct seasons. The wet season Around the November-December time we have usually fine days, however late in the afternoon we have thunderstorm activity along the ranges and to the west.
More predominantly I think during February we have the greatest percentage of thunderstorms making their way through the Cairns area. With thunderstorms developing on the tablelands, which is up over 4,000 feet high, as those thunderstorms do make their way off the tablelands themselves towards the airport, we generally do see them collapse.
Later in the wet season, around January, February, March, we have the monsoonal rains usually come through.
The frequency of the monsoon, it comes and goes. 1 minute it can be fine and beaut, and then the next minute pouring rain, so it changes very quickly.
The dry season is from April through to about October, and our main weather in that early part of April through to say August is southeasterly trade winds, where we have the big high pressure systems down south directing moist southeasterly winds onto the coast. The moist southeasterly winds come into contact with the high terrain and create showers and cloud.
We don't have too many worries with weather. And so somebody that learns to fly could go right through their training and not experience any weather conditions at all.
Okay, outbound from Cairns, if you're going to the south, there is a couple of main ways that you could go. There is out to the east via False Cape and down the coast, and that's probably the most scenic way and probably the best way if the weather is a little bit marginal.
If we look straight ahead of us, we can see the track outbound to the southeast on about a 150 track is down through the valley there. The weather looks pretty marginal down the valley, and there's some high terrain to the south down there. So rather than tackling the terrain and the showers, we're going to head out to the east out here via False Cape. When there's a strong southeasterly wind blowing, it is quite rough past False Cape, because the wind comes over the Murray-Pryor range there, causes some mechanical turbulence. In winds above about 25 knots, it is very rough here, and often it's difficult to maintain altitude because of the updrafts and downdrafts. So not sure about being able to maintain altitude, possibly best to request a not above level, like not above 1,500 feet, just to allow you to be able to go up and down a little, but to stay within air traffic control tolerance. As we can see ahead here, the cloud base is getting quite a bit lower. Out to the right-hand side down the coast, though, the weather does look okay. All right, so there's quite a bit of sun shining on the water down the coast, so it still looks okay to proceed. But we've had to request special VFR, and we're just ducking down now to about 1,000 feet, just to stay nice and clear of the cloud. And being special VFR, the requirement is we just have to remain clear of cloud and in sight of ground or water at all times. One other thing you do have to be careful of if you are tracking down this way, outbound from Cairns, these showers will come in from the east. And if you're tracking down this way and you're not sure whether the weather is going to be any good for you to continue, what you don't want to have happen is the weather behind you to close in, because these showers will move in towards the airport, and if they're heavy, that could mean you can't get back to Cairns. So just keep an eye on the back door. Alright, so as we can see, we're coming down the coast here to the east of Cairns, and we've got High Island out to the left here, and we can see the weather's getting pretty marginal. Coast further ahead, a few miles ahead, they're starting to disappear. We just have a bit of a look back behind us and make sure that that our back door is still open. We can see back to Fitzroy Island and back to the peninsula at Yarrabah. There's some very high terrain around here, so as I said, coastal is often the best option, but as we can see, the weather's getting even more marginal now. Out to sea, it still doesn't look particularly good. Cloud base over High Island is very low, 522 feet, looking like a good time to turn around and go back. And they might just do a gentle turn and head back up the coast.
They really need to look and study the weather over the route, and if it's not going to work, then they should consider the other options like delaying, going somewhere else.
But generally the airport here, even in these sort of conditions where you have the cloud around, you'll see it developing back up across the Murray-Pryor ranges, you'll see it develop up across the tablelands just to the west and along the hills, but the airport itself generally in these conditions stay quite fine. Main influence, I suppose we're looking at that people don't recognise a lot of the time. The Great Dividing Range extends the whole way right up along the east coast of Australia itself and extends right up past sort of Lockhart River up through that area. But we're still getting very high hills right up through here, and topography plays a large part in what sort of weather we're actually going to see along the coastal fringes. That's where most of the people live.
If you're heading out to the west, there's a point called Stony Creek on the chart. Stony Creek in Babora. It's the lowest area of terrain, and it takes you over the drier part of the Mareeba area where there's usually less shower activity.
Now, on a day like today, Stony Creek can be particularly marginal. Often the gap in the hills is closed due to cloud, so it's often closed to VFR aircraft. We've got a lot of high terrain that we've got to climb over the top of, and also low cloud. There's also usually quite a lot of turbulence through this gap in the hills, so keep that in mind and keep a nice safe distance from the terrain, 500 feet from the terrain. As we can see, we need 1,000 controlled airspace, we need 1,000 feet clearance from cloud, unless we request special VFR. Looking through Stony Creek today, we're going to need to request special VFR because we'll definitely be closer than 1,000 feet. Now, if the weather through here looks at all marginal, especially if you're unfamiliar with the area, it's best to just return straight to Cairns. There is higher terrain behind Stony Creek, so it's to be approached with particular caution. You want a reasonable gap through here, ideally at least 1,000 feet to get through here. We've probably got around about, I'd guess, 700 or 800 feet clearance through there at the moment. And we can see the sun shining through on the other side, and we can see the terrain on the other side. So it's safe at the moment for us to continue. But if there was any showers passing through here and low cloud, it's just not to be tackled with. As you can see, there is some very, very high terrain here. About 15 years ago, there was an aircraft lost on the top of this mountain here. This mountain's Mount William or Calpanan Rock. Okay, I'm now at about 2,100 feet, getting fairly close to the clouds, so I'll level out the aircraft here for the moment. One thing you have to watch when you're coming through Stony Creek is the updrafts. If you're quite close to the cloud, you can get updrafts through here, which could put you into cloud if you're too close, so stay well clear of the cloud. As we can see, looking ahead west from Stony Creek, the weather does look pretty okay. It looks good enough VFR to continue on, and there's not too many showers around.
Outbound to the north is simply along the coast up to the north, but you need to be very mindful of the fact that there aren't many airstrips up to the north of here. It's 430 odd miles of Cape York Peninsula.
Also, the problem with tracking northbound from here is fuel stops are few and far between. There's fuel available at places like Cooktown, but it is drum fuel, so you've got to buy a whole drum. And the nearest Bowser fuel on the Cape is probably about 250 nautical miles up the road. If you're coming into Cairns from the west and the weather's marginal, the hills may preclude you from getting into Cairns. Mareeba is a town to the southwest of Cairns. So Mareeba is only about an hour's drive from Cairns, so you're much better off to land the aircraft in Mareeba and either wait for the weather to improve or leave your aircraft at Mareeba and drive the rest of the way. The weather's nice, it's not a problem. Cairns Approach will vector you through a suitable place for your entry, but if the weather's marginal as it is today, we can see that a lot of the terrain ahead is actually in cloud. Very difficult to tell one gap from another. Just make sure you keep turning back, looking at Mareeba to make sure that a door open for you to return back to Mareeba if required. Okay, the lowest point in the terrain that you can see ahead is Stony Creek, and of course it's marked on the VTC. If you're unable to maintain your altitude due to cloud, best thing is to get an airways clearance to operate not above a particular level. For example, not above 3,500. Gives you the flexibility to remain well clear of cloud. Now we can safely see through to the ocean now, so I'm happy that that's a safe gap between the clouds and the terrain. If there are showers coming, they'll be coming probably from the south in these southeasterlies. Might look okay at the moment, but if there's showers coming over the hills, you'll get another 5 minutes down the road and it'll be closed.
There have been some problems with pilots coming in from the west and asked to track to Stony Creek and those sorts of things, and rather than asking for tracking advice, they've gone on thinking that it's there and actually it's over there.
The other way, the most direct route to the south, is down the Mulgrave Valley. Now there's some very high terrain down there and the weather does tend to hang around in the valleys a bit. So if you're not familiar with the area, it's really not a good way to go because you could get, basically into the wrong valley, which can be dangerous.
The weather's marginal. This is really not the way to go. The highest mountain in Queensland is in that shower there. We've got Bellin and Kerr and Bartle Frere, both around the 5,300 feet. The big danger with flying down here in bad weather is that there are quite a number of valleys that you could accidentally take. The main valley is the one ahead of us there, which the showers are fairly thick down that way. Slightly off to the right of that, just basically left of that pyramid-shaped mountain, there is another valley. That valley is a dead end. About 10 years ago, an aircraft was lost down there in bad weather. The pilot took the wrong valley at 1,000 feet. And collided with the terrain. These valleys are very narrow, and if you accidentally flew down them, you may not be able to turn the aircraft around. Outbound from Cairns via Gordonvale to the southwest over Gordonvale and Atherton area is a possibility in nice weather. If we look out over there today, though, we can see beyond Gordonvale the terrain's in cloud, so it's effectively closed to VFR. You wouldn't attempt to get over the ranges there today, because the cloud is right on the hills.
Flying into IMC around here is a very dangerous business if you're not properly trained and legally able to do it, because there is terrain everywhere.
They really need always to have a backup plan, at least one backup plan, and if they start to run out of that, then they've got a problem.
Keep bigger safety margins, keep further away from the cloud, and careful planning will keep you away from the weather. And if in doubt, if the weather ahead is not good, if in doubt, turn around and go back to where you came from. Always keep that back door open.
The weather in southeast Queensland has a strong seasonal component. Most of the precipitation falls in summer when the wind is either from the southeast or the northeast, and there's a distinct rainfall maximum anywhere between November and April.
Flying in the mornings is generally the best way to go because the weather phenomenon usually occurs later in the day after there's been a bit of heating and a bit of mixing, and we get the thunderstorms that come around at the same time every day.
Generally, thunderstorms tend to build up on elevated heat sources, so a mountain range is perfect. In southeast Queensland, most of our storms build up on the ranges, and in particular the McPherson and the Main Range, because they're the highest.
So if you're coming up from the south, for example, and you're coming inland, as many people do, the weather you've been flying through is fine, not a problem at all, until you get to the range or going around the Toowoomba area, and suddenly the weather's socked in.
And Toowoomba is on the Darling Downs, so you've got a plateau country, and there's only small dips occasionally in the plateau that would let you slip through if ever you're going to attempt that.
Well, here's the situation where we've been flying up for Casino. We've just overflown Kyogle. We want to go either to Archerfield or further up the coast in southeast Queensland. So if we look ahead now, we can see the escarpment, and there's little dips in the escarpment. Now we're on the 340 track to Larravale, and it will take us through some little dips that we see. What occurs here seasonally is that the low cloud on the coast will rise as it passes over all that high ground just inland from the coast. And we can either find our way through these little gaps ahead at 3,500 feet, or we can track further up towards Mount Lindsay and Mount Barney, in which there is a further lower gap to take us through into the Bow Desert Valley and for a safe approach into Archerfield. But again, we can't really go below 3,500 because of all these peaks, and certainly if there was cloud ahead and we could not see through like we can see through today, we would not venture any further and would turn back to Casino. We're approaching Mount Gibbs, where my thumb is on the map, and that's where the border loop is. Now down below is the interstate railway line running from New South Wales into Queensland. The railway line goes through that low pass that we see ahead. That is the best geographical feature in which to follow at this point in time, together with the heading of 350. If we cannot clearly see through to the Bow Desert Valley, then it is certainly a no-go situation.
Winters in most of Queensland, particularly the southeast, are often dry the wind starts to shift around more to the west and leads to a lot of areas of clear skies. However, that has some problems too. If the wind from the southwest becomes too strong, mountain waves coming over the ranges are quite a problem, and particularly for the airports that are right up close to the ranges. The Gold Coast is probably the worst in southeast Queensland for that sort of thing.
I mean, if you're going to fly and enjoy it, winter time in Queensland is really the time to come and do it. Crystal blue skies, light winds.
But winter into early or mid-spring tends to be the fog season, a little bit of moisture around the ground and generally clear skies and light winds at night.
There's a couple areas of concern, and that is if you are flying south from Archerfield or if you're coming up from south to Archerfield, you have to negotiate Coolangatta area. Now there's a lot of high ground around Coolangatta, and on days when there are strong moist onshore winds, you can get rain areas, you can get low cloud, and it does penetrate into high ground. Again, cumulogranitus cloud which is hiding rock. To negotiate those areas, you have to be very careful that you don't close your back door and you don't close your side door, and you never go through a gap if you cannot see clearly VMC through to the other side and beyond.
The situation here is we've left Warwick, we've had descending cloud base towards the escarpment here. I'm sitting at 3,500 and I would not go below 3,500. And I've throttled back to a VB speed of about 90 knots so that I can go through Cunningham Gap. Below us at about our 1 o'clock is the Cunningham Highway, and through the gap here we'll be onto lower ground passing Boona on the way to Archerfield, either via Amberley or via the inbound reporting point of Park Ridge. Now the peaks around us here are just under 4,000, and I'm counting on these gaps being absolutely clear. If I could not see through these gaps, I would have turned back long ago. Well, having successfully got through the gap, we can maintain 3,500 all the way to the side of Flinders Peak in the distance, and then on into Archerfield via Park Ridge.
Coming down from the north, you do have the problem again that it can be hemmed in on the coast. So the inland trek via, say, Kilcoy to Watts Bridge and down the back of the mountains to Amberley and into Archerfield is a safer bet than trying to push through rain shower and scud activity on the coast.
Now just ahead of us is the Daybro Valley, and on a day like today we don't have a cloud problem, but the cloud does tend to lower and converge with the peaks that we can see just out to the right. Now that's the highest ground around Brisbane, and also controlled airspace comes down very close to that high ground. It would be safer to take up the option of either going coastal, as we mentioned earlier, or diverting inland to about our 2 o'clock position and going down the lake area to Lake Manchester and in via Goodna or the TV towers. That would put us in the lee of all the weather that would be coming in from the ocean with the help of the southeast trades. Well, we're coming up to the TV towers. We're currently at 2,500 feet. We will descend to 1,500 for entry to Archerfield. Now, generally here, as we can see the smoke ahead, if the southeast trades are active in a low pressure system, then there could well be rain shower and cloud activity below our altitude. The situation is if you can't see the TV towers clearly at this range here, which are about 10 miles ahead, then it's going to be non-VFR going through this gap.
Daybro is an area where you must ensure that you can see the high ground ahead. You're coming down towards the TV towers, and if cloud is in amongst those TV towers, then you should not attempt to come down that way, because again, cumulogranitus.
The private pilot who flies for pleasure, perhaps in the winters in Queensland because the weather's so fine, he does most of his flying through the winter months, goes south or somewhere else, gets caught. You have to say, well, do you really need to go today? If you look at the forecast and there's some doubt, don't even bother about it, don't go.
Weather forecasting, unfortunately, is still not an exact science despite everything that we've got. And I guess we try to treat weather forecasts as professional advice rather than an absolute guarantee of what's going to happen. I think the thing we struggle most with in southeast Queensland, in fact probably most of Queensland, is the exact location of low cloud and fog overnight, and also the timing of its development. Sometimes it can come in fairly soon after the sun goes down in winter, other times it may not develop until the early hours of the morning. But trying to decide exactly where it's going to form is one of our more difficult functions. The other one, I guess, is in a changing weather situation where you've identified this is a day of showers and storms, say a typical summer afternoon, and you pick an area where you think storms will occur, but then as the day rolls on, that area can move, and it might be the storms actually might move into an area where we didn't originally forecast them. So pilots need to be on the alert in those sort of situations.
It's that getting down off the high ground that one should be very careful about. And again, it's the push on ITIS, it's the attempt to slip through gaps that really are not VFR that can cause concern.
The top end's a unique area. It's not like the weather down south. You can actually fly VFR up in the northern parts of Australia most of the year round.
Well, we experience two main seasons, the wet season and the dry season.
The dry season has 3 periods in it itself. The dry season is fine, clear, beautiful. The beginning with green ground and blue skies, lovely flying.
The Gulf of Carpentaria during the dry season can experience large areas of fog. The area around MacArthur River and the Roper River valleys are both two very prone fog areas. So we often talk about coastal and river valleys on our R4s when referring to fog.
Airstrips that have valleys, Port Keats, Data River Mission. Out to the east, there's various strips out there subject to fog as well. Later in the dry season, about August, we start with fires, much smoke, and severely reduced visibility from time to time.
That sometimes can get to the stage where you could only make an instrument approach. I've flown in here into Darwin where it was just impossible to do anything but an instrument approach.
It's almost like being IMC. The haze can be terrible up here, especially on days where there's lots of fires, and particularly in the mornings when there's a low-level inversion can trap the smoke at low levels. And when you're airborne and looking through the smoke on an angle, it's the visibility can be very low, and especially close to the fires as well.
Actually, two particular parts to the wet season. There's the monsoon, which can generally comes around in periods of lasts for a couple of weeks, and then there's what we call a break period, and then we might go back into the monsoon again. So we may get 3 or 4 monsoon periods during a wet season. On average, there are about 2 cyclones affect the Gulf of Carpentaria each year. And these are a particular problem when they cross over land and go inland. Not only can they bring strong winds with them, for a tropical cyclone the radar image is showing us the position and where the worst weather is, but it's not showing how intense that rainfall is. So it can look like it's underestimating the amount of rainfall that is actually occurring. When the Gulf lines tend to move inland, across the Arnhem Land and the Kakadu area, they can be enhanced over this area because of that large area of hot rock, and there's also plenty of moisture and other elements contributing to that. They can form into squall lines off the Arnhem Land escarpment and continue travelling to the west towards Darwin, and they can bring showers to the eastern Arnhem coast during the morning. With these squall lines is often associated severe wind gusts. It's a continuous or a fairly continuous line of thunderstorms along the line. It can be broken in places, and there's usually quite heavy rainfall associated with these squall lines.
The wet season, we're talking about the trough line moving from the north to the south, stationary at various periods, which creates huge areas of low cloud and heavy rainfall, making a VFR flight impossible. We've got to accept those periods, and if we encounter them, we've got to be prepared to sit on the ground for anything up to a week.
The pilots up here can ask for a number of things, starting from when they're on the ground. They can ask for an observation on their outbound track or advice on where to go. In flight, they can talk to the radar controller or the tower controller and ask for some help, whether it be a prediction of what the weather's doing or look ahead on the radar and is there a gap here between the weather? Do you think I'll be able to get through this way? Or just general advice, we can help out with that. And what we have at our end is basically our radar screen with a primary radar that will highlight the weather on an instantaneous basis, and we also have a weather radar feed which provides 10-minute increments of the weather pattern.
But you can, with the haze and everything else, it's very difficult to distinguish between where the water and then the sky meets, so where your horizon, where the actual horizon is. So again, it suddenly puts the private pilot into a situation where he needs to rely on his instruments a lot more.
Blue out is a problem of visibility or lack of horizon. It can happen on the most beautiful days. You can have a lovely blue sky and blue water. If you're travelling, say, from here to the north towards Bathurst Island, it's about 40 miles, and there's a period of time when you can't see the ground, and if there's a bit of haze, you haven't got an horizon either. And so for the inexperienced pilot who doesn't have an instrument rating, you'll find it very difficult to maintain straight and level flight. If you happen to get caught in this situation, you realise that you've got a problem, divert and travel via one of the VFR routes, which does have islands, and therefore you do have contact with the ground to give you some form of horizon.
If you happen to find yourself in trouble or looking at diminishing options when it comes to weather, please don't hesitate to call. There are all sorts of air traffic services out there. You don't have to be in a controlled environment like a military aerodrome. You can be OCTA and still be able to get Flight Watch and other control agencies on HF and VHF. They're all there to help. And yeah, you're not alone out there, so make sure you speak up if you're likely to get into trouble.
Really, we only basically got 2 seasons, really, summer and winter. We don't really have a lot of spring and autumn. So in summer where we have, very hot and doesn't rain, and then in winter where we get the fronts and hopefully we get the rain.
With WA being quite a large state, there's pretty much you can split it into 2 sections. You've got your northern and your southern area. The northern area is more your monsoon season or your wet season and your dry season, and you've got a couple of transition months in there. The southern part is more in the mid-latitude, so you've got more Mediterranean style. The winters are quite wet, a lot of fronts coming through, whereas in summer the high pressure systems actually move further south, so it's often easterly winds. You're getting more just troughs down the west coast, so you're looking at more thunderstorms. And those moist areas where you've had low cloud can often become into fog situations for a couple of days. And once the cloud band moves through, you'll pretty much have fine conditions again.
If we have fog here, normally we got fog at Chandicott, at Perth, at Gingin, at Murrayfield, and even inland, at Northam and York.
Fog's probably one of the trickiest to forecast, and it's probably one of the ones that you can't pick as far out. I mean, sometimes it's like you can be quite confident in an extent saying we're not really going to have fog.
Now, if we are here and we're getting coastal fog, it's a little bit difficult for us to go back to Chandicott, so we have to get the clearance to go through Perth and get the special clearance so we can get back.
The cold fronts tend to swing through fairly quickly here because they arrive, and once they get held up a little bit at the southwest corner usually, all of a sudden it's like a big elastic band. It just goes chipang and away it goes across to the other side.
Sometimes you can get mid-level moisture associated with the front, so you get more rain periods, and then sometimes the front may be just a short, sharp line which will move through. Often the rainfall can deteriorate as it goes inland a little bit, so your worst affected areas are going to be the coastal parts.
The big problem is when you end up too far south in an aeroplane of the training types of aircraft, you can find yourself heading back into Perth with a strengthening headwind component, sometimes as much as 50 or even more than 50% of the total speed of the aircraft, and the front's starting to move in. The weather deteriorates rapidly after a certain point. As soon as the wind switched west of north, it brings in the moist maritime air from up over the ocean.
The weather comes in from the southwest, so we got to make sure we look back every now and then to keep the door open so we can turn back early enough to make it back to Chandicott. Because if that's cut off and we can't land at Chandicott anymore, we have not a lot of options here when you track northbound.
The distances between suitable airfields are enormous, so it's very, very important that people have alternates even in summertime. People have to remember too up north that when it's raining, the soil is sort of a red soil. It becomes, unsafe for landing on an airstrip.
As we can see now, it looks quite clear on this area here. But if you look towards the southwest, there is some showers down there. And one just has to look out to the coast and see what's behind it, what's going to come in, and then make an assessment. If we're looking at the weather from the coast, we got to make allowance that when it hits the land, it actually intensifies. The showers will get worse. So quite often people can get the feeling, oh, it's not too bad over the coast. I'll be able to fly through here. And then by the time that shower actually hits the land, it's going to be much bigger. And so the weather is different again.
Because we're in the west, we're the people who get a lot of the weather systems first, and we've got no obs to go by. It's only in the ocean, and you've got some buoy obs and ship obs, but there's not a lot to come. So we do rely on a lot of the radar and the satellite pictures.
Often you will find that that layer, you can just see the cloud on the escarpment from Perth. And you say, yeah, that looks good. And you can get across at a reasonable altitude for a reasonable distance of time. But the insidious nature of the whole thing is that the cloud base gradually lowers as you get further and further into the goldfield. If the cold front has been significant enough to drop a lot of rain in the goldfields, it is very common in those areas, in the Kalgoorlie, Leonora, Laverton area, Wiluna area, anywhere in that area there, to have low cloud, as low as 150 feet, right through the entire area with absolutely no significant VFR options once you get into that area. And so if you tend to press on into a situation like that, you can find yourself very quickly in one of two situations, either in the cloud or VFR on top of the cloud, because it's usually fairly thin, with no way of getting down.
So as we can see, the hills are not very high, but we can still get forced down to the ground very quickly. We're flying at 2,000 feet here, cloud base, and next thing, we're getting very close to the ground. So at the moment, the hill you can see in the distance there, it's another big feature here, and that's Mount Bakewell in York, and that's nearly 100 kilometers away from here.
It's more of a problem if you come in from the east, tracking to the west, because as you're coming in from the east, you cannot see over the escarpment, so it may look quite okay in the east, but if we have some weather approaching from the west, the clouds get banked up against the escarpment, and when you come to the escarpment, you can't get below the cloud, so therefore, you cannot come to Chandicott or to go to Perth. And then, of course, because that tiger country is very wide, it's up to 80 to 100 kilometers wide between York, that sort of area, and Perth, it's a long way to go back. So people really have to plan well ahead to have plenty of fuel and daylight, so they can, if they come back towards Perth and they can't come into Chandicott or Perth, that they can turn around and go back up and land at one of the alternates on the other side of the tiger country.
From the further north you go, there is a potential there for the cloud to gradually dissipate, but once you get a very strong cold front come through where the goldfields have received a lot of rain, or even a small amount of rain, it is very frequently that low cloud and drizzle can still persevere for as much as 5 days after the cold front.
And those moist areas where you've had low cloud can often become into fog situations for a couple of days. And once the cloud band moves through, you pretty much have fine conditions again.
Now here, because we are quite low and Perth Airport is quite close to the hills, if you rely on VORs or NDBs, it's actually not that easy to get a positive reading because we are below line of sight. Even though we are quite close to Perth, so we couldn't really use those the VOR, for instance, as a navigation aid. Now we're looking straight ahead towards the south. That's where we have a little bit higher mountains. They go up as high as 2,000 feet. Mount Cook, slightly to our left, that's sort of the highest point around. So again, if I can see that mountain in the clouds, so it gives you an indication of what the cloud base is, be 2,000 feet there, or over here we got Montel as well, which gives us an indication then how high the cloud base is. So when we come across here from all this tiger country, it's very important to have a plan that we have enough fuel. We know we have an alternate that we can go back all the way back out there again to York or Beverly in case the weather is not good on here and we cannot go across the hills. So it's very important to have a plan by the time we get to here, because it's a long way to go back. We can see the valley, Armadale here. That's sort of the biggest valley we've got around here. So you can see maybe when you look down the valley, if somebody was flying up the valley, tried to get across the hills, it doesn't really lead anywhere, because it just gets up to here to this dam, and then therefore you're in exactly the same height anyway, so not really an option.
In summer we can get thunderstorms in the afternoons, mainly probably a little bit further inland as well, but that could be an issue. Or we get the cyclones, you know, which are up north, long way up north, but every now and then we may get some cyclones just come nearly down to Perth.
The cyclones, they're during the monsoon season, so often November to April, but not saying that it can't occur either side of those times as well for a little bit. They often occur up in the northern part, and if they do cross the coast, often it's the northern part of the coast of WA they cross in the Pilbara. Cyclones, you pretty much just want to stay away from them, really. They're quite extensive, widespread. You're looking at rain, showers.
Especially West Australia anyway, it's a very windy place, full stop, because we get the Fremantle Doctor, sea breezes, they get very, very strong. And, you know, especially if you go off and land at Rottnest, for instance, you know, we may have one wind direction here at Chandicott, but then you fly to Rottnest, it'll maybe 90 degrees different, and quite often it is.
Another thing which can happen here, if you are operating in the training area and you're doing your exercises, doing practice and things like that, and you're not keeping an eye on the weather, like at the moment we've got a couple of showers out there, but they're not too substantial, but it could be more. So you're doing your exercises here, and before you know, the door is starting to close because the weather is starting to move in, and if you got another shower up here at Chandicott or something up there, you could end up between the bad weather and the hills there, and you couldn't go back to Manger anymore, so you end up in an area here where you haven't got many places to go. So this is a little bit something that one has to be careful of. Now you can see on the right hand side there, we can see Chandicott okay from here, but some of those photos I'd taken before, you do not see Chandicott and you do not see the city, but if it's a beautiful day like this, it's obviously very clear to see. We can see now already that it's getting a little bit darker down there. The shower is starting to get a little bit more intense, and I would anticipate over the next hour or so, it'll get more and more.
Main season everyone thinks about in Adelaide is it's hot and dry. Certainly through February the temperatures skyrocket well above 40 degrees, even here at Parapol near the sea. So during the summer months, as things dry out, you tend to get those big dust storms that come through. If you have a front coming through, the forecast may indicate localised raised dust, and that can reduce visibility reasonably quickly.
The dust can be widespread, it can be persistent, it can last for several hours or even up to half a day, and can blanket out quite a large area.
From time to time in summertime we get a frontal system that comes through, and if there's sufficient low level moisture following that frontal system, we do get some low cloud along the coastal regions, particularly the southern ends of Kangaroo Island, the western parts of the state from west of Ceduna and the far lower southeast coastal areas. But that low cloud, because of the warmth of the land and the amount of incoming radiation during the day, tends not to last too long of the day. It burns off quite quickly and generally doesn't extend very far inland.
When we've got a high pressure and the wind is coming from the sea, it's quite often we get very low stratus and strato Q that hang around the coast and a couple hundred miles inland and can be persistent for days, even weeks on end.
So now we're levelling off at top of Clyde. We're looking towards the hills, and we can just start to make out Boulevard Strobe in the distance, which is a good marker to say that we are heading towards South Para Reservoir. And you can already starting to make your mind up about weather conditions. On a day like today, we can see the cloud is actually well and truly clear of the mountains. But what we're looking for as we look ahead as to whether or not there are any layers of cloud that come down and look as if they touch the horizon. Anything you see in front of you that comes down and touches the horizon really means it's at your level. So if you maintain this height up to the point where the cloud is, then you're going to enter the cloud. Looking out to the right, you can see in the distance, that's the Lofty Range, the Mount Lofty Towers. We can see that there's no cloud anywhere near the tops of the hills. So at this stage, at least on this side of the hills, it's quite good VFR flying conditions.
We can get lee turbulence, lee side of the Mount Lofty Ranges or the Victorian side of the Mount Lofty Ranges, and that can extend for 100, even up to 150 nautical miles in the lee of the Mount Lofty Ranges. And it's quite common with a very fast moving front to even get tornado activity and waterspouts over the sea.
Although our mountains in South Australia, some would say they're not mountains, they're just high ground, but there is sufficient lift goes on over that high ground to form low cloud, in particular along the Mount Lofty Ranges immediately east of Adelaide and in the southern parts of the Flinders Ranges, which extend northwards from the Mount Lofty Ranges.
May not be in our immediate flight path, but that low cloud would be moving back towards South Para Reservoir. So in an hour's time, if we're planning to head back via South Para Reservoir, there's low cloud in that area, it would be moving in the direction of South Para. This is a good direction to go because the ground's actually falling away from us. We're actually flying in towards the lower ground level. So generally speaking, once you get through this high terrain and seeing it's clear, generally the flying's going to be reasonably straightforward from this point on. Murray Bridge ALA is an airstrip that our company uses quite often, not just for circuit training, but coming back in towards Parafield and Adelaide. If the weather is getting low over the hills, rather than continuing into poor weather, we come back and land here at Murray Bridge because it's not that far away. It's a good all-weather strip. It is a gravel strip, but it's being prepared and rolled. So even if it pours with rain in this area, you can still land and taxi on the hard stands without fear of getting bogged. So it's a very good alternate airfield for those that are travelling towards Parafield or indeed Adelaide.
In Adelaide, the katabatic winds are called, we call them the gully winds, and often they're referred to gully winds on the forecasts that you hear on the radio and you see on the TV. It's a very Adelaidean term. You'll find gully winds, especially very strong in summer, on both sides of the Mount Lofty Ranges. You'll get them on the Parafield side, but you'll also get them on the Murray Bridge side of the Adelaide Hills.
The next leg that we're going to fly, going from Salute across the South Para Reservoir, has a magnetic track of 300 degrees. And we do have a couple of choices. One, if the weather's looking quite dark all the way around in front of us and it looks quite dark and the cloud base is getting low over the hills towards the South Para Reservoir, it might be another good decision to go back and increase our stay at Murray Bridge and just wait for the weather to lift a little bit higher. Or if it looks like there's just a few rain showers in this area, but generally speaking all the reports are that the cloud base is 2,500 feet and it's quite clear at Parafield. And to the north it looks quite clear. We can extend our flight path to the north and track towards the NDB of Stonefield. You can see we're just skirting the high terrain. When we get to Stonefield, the plan from there will be to follow the Sturt Highway down to Truro and then to come back down to South Para Reservoir. What we do by this nav route is we just bypass this little bit of high terrain here that we've got to otherwise fly over. So just on this little nav route that we're flying from Murray Bridge up to Stonefield, there's 1, 2, 3 little airfields that generally they need prior permission if you are planning to use them, but again if the weather is turning sour, they're available for use in an emergency if you start getting caught out. You can see generally as we're going in this direction out in this area, the high terrain is generally coming down, and if we look further to the north, you can see the hills are starting to really flatten out. That's why coming further north to get into Parafield is advisable. route when the weather does get a little bit lower. You can see the high ground, but you can also now start to see the Barossa Valley, and it's generally lower ground, so this is good. We're flying from, yes, we're low over some high terrain, but the terrain is generally starting to fall away from us. But before we commit ourselves to turning and heading in that direction, I'm having a good look in that area to make sure that it does actually look clear. If it looks fairly dark and I can't see too far in that direction, again, I wouldn't continue into a worsening case of weather, dark cloud, rain showers. If there was fog in this area over the Barossa Valley, I'd be starting to suspect fog in the Parafield area as well. You can see here, this heading in this direction, it's actually reasonably clear and it's looking fine to continue in this direction. However, definitely wouldn't want to be any lower than this. If I found myself being forced lower and lower due to a lowering cloud base, I wouldn't continue. Heading back towards South Para Reservoir, the aeronautical beacon's giving us a good reference point as to where the South Para Reservoir is. So what we're doing now is we're just following up this valley, being sure not to fly too low over build-up areas and avoiding build-up areas wherever we can if we are low. But you can see here that we've got a nice corridor at the foothills heading up towards South Para. The only problem being, when we do come around the corner here, you may be faced with a lot of clouds sitting on this side of the ranges that you may not have seen until you got up to the Truro area. Again, if we've got southwesterly breezes coming off the Vincent Gulf, the cloud generally will start to pile up against the hills here. So it may not be passable. Again, in overcast conditions, you need to give yourself more of a margin of error with your arrival times with respects to last light conditions. And South Para in the distance.
A lot of people say Melbourne weather's unpredictable, 4 seasons in one day. I think probably the most dangerous thing about Melbourne's weather for pilots is when we have southwesterly changes. Because Melbourne is surrounded by mountains, southwesterly change moves through and the weather backs up on the mountains such as the Dandenongs and the Great Dividing Ranges, where 2 of the main gaps are the Narberthon Gap, the Glenburn Gap and the Kilmore Gap is also in that area. So that's when it becomes dangerous, when we have those southwesterly changes.
So once you get airborne and Moorabbin, you can have you can see the city. You can see up towards Mount Macedon, up to the northwest. You can see up towards past the Dandenongs, and you've got a fairly good idea straight away what the weather conditions are going to be like.
Cold fronts are certainly stronger in the winter time and also early spring.
You've got your stable conditions in the summer and so forth, your high pressure systems where the weather's generally good, but you may have a lot of low cloud around, a lot of stratus and that sort of stuff. And it hangs around the valleys and the hills and whatever.
We all get a forecast and we might say, oh, that's not what's happening here, but it might actually be happening where you're going. You can, for instance, in the Kilmore Gap, you can look at the forecast for the Kilmore Gap. There's a telephone number you can ring. You can ring up and actually hear what the forecast or what the weather is actually doing in the Kilmore Gap.
And I've dialed it up there. And I'll turn the volume up. I'll have an automated service telling me what the weather's like at Kilmore.
AWS weather. Wind 010 degrees.
Already in view, we can see Yanyeen Reservoir coming up on our left-hand side there, and it's in the right spot. Mount Disappointment, and aircraft have come to grief in that on that mountain. Poor visibility, low cloud along here, and heading in the wrong direction. Especially if you enter cloud, that mountain or hill would be obscured. West over there on my left-hand side, you can see the remainder of the Great Dividing Range, and that part there is Mount Macedon, which is the highest point over there on the west. Because if you look further north there, you can see how the terrain tends to flatten out again. A little peak over there, little hill sitting up by itself, that's Mount Piper, and that's to the north of Kilmore. It's actually a beam Broadford. So once you've passed that point there, you're well clear of most of the terrain. That subtle rise in terrain is sort of creeping up on you, and once we get to Kilmore there, we might not even have our 1,000 foot above a build-up area, so that's how subtly the terrain rises. So if you've got a cloud base around here at 1,500 feet above sea level, it's probably fairly well on the ground.
In the winter time, of course, we also get a lot of fogs. If you get a light northerly then developing during the morning, all that fog will start to lift and then bank up on the ranges.
If you're coming from the west, In the past, actually, people would come directly via Bacchus Marsh. The terrain drops away fairly rapidly there. These days, of course, they'll actually come via places like Avalon. And Avalon is a fairly easy place to transit. It's an MBZ most of the time, and sometimes it's a control zone. But that's an area of low terrain which is easy to find, easy to transit through.
Around the Mount Macedon area, there is most people will track up past the Calder Highway, up over Wood End, Kyneton, and those areas there, VFR. If you're not sure of the Mount Macedon weather or the weather in the Mount Macedon area, one good thing to do is to land at a place called Bacchus Marsh and get out and have a look. On the ground at Bacchus Marsh, on a good day, you can actually see Mount Macedon. If the cloud is on the top of Mount Macedon or above, then you'll be able to get through that area.
Now we're flying probably what's referred to as a recommended VFR route. In other words, it's recommended because it's over a particular route which has adequate VFR features for fixing your position. But this, for the VFR pilot, provides probably one of the better visual routes to enable him or her to get to the Kilmore position, for example. Sugarloaf is now coming up on our nose, and from that point we'll make initially a turn towards Narberthong. That'll take us over Yarra Glen and also Healesville as we go up towards Narberthong, and we can also start increasing our altitude. There is a distinct area in here that you can see. Over to the right, the hills, the cloud is sitting on the hills there, but it's a bit higher on this side. And that area there is basically that gap we're talking about, which is a point or an area of lower terrain, so that you could work your way through there. As you can see, that if the cloud base was down a lot lower and the visibility was poor, it could be a very dangerous situation to be in, to be flying through that area. It would not be my number one choice for heading up to the northeast of Victoria.
In the winter time, of course, we also get a lot of fogs. In the north of the state, you get very low temperatures at night, below zero quite often, and fogs are definitely prevalent. If you get a light northerly then developing during the morning, all that fog will start to lift and then bank up on the ranges.
View of the Dandenongs again from this direction, so if you're coming down from Narberthong, the terrain obviously drops away fairly quickly, and you've got fairly flat terrain surrounded by a number of hills, in particular Dandenongs. The Dandenongs is a good reference point. It's got the aerials on top for the television towers. But as you return to Melbourne or Moorabbin, the terrain is fairly flat and there's never really too much of a problem. If the weather was a problem to you and you got yourself in a situation up here, there are a number of aerodromes around this place that you can use to actually land at if the weather was a problem. It's better, of course, to prepare to land at those places prior to going rather than sort of decide to do it on the spur of the moment. But we have Lilydale Airport, which is over here, and also Coldstream Airport are over there as well. So they're located on the VTC chart, and they're fairly easy to find.
One of the things that occurs, especially in rain or drizzle, is VFR pilots tend to push on. 5Ks is a very little distance. And a good judge is, if you're sitting in the aeroplane, flying the aeroplane, and you're actually having to look out the window on the side to see where you are instead of looking forward, and the forward visibility you got is no longer any good, and you should consider turning around or diverting to where there's better weather.
Now the Glenberg gets a little bit more friendly, if you like, than the Narberthong one, but again, it still has some fairly quickly rising terrain, and it's not exactly the best route to plan to the northeast of Victoria if you've got another choice. There's a bit of a fairly distinct gap between the terrain on the right and left, a bit more of a gap over here if you like, but basically that is the Glenburn gap directly in front of us. This is the sort of situation if you were down lower flying through the valley and you've got the gap there, but you've got poor visibility and there's cloud coming, and you try to manoeuvre the aeroplane. Well, at the speed we're doing now, to try and manoeuvre the aeroplane between these two hills here would be probably cause a lot of problem. Okay, the radius of turn is quite large, so you'd need to, if you wanted to go back, you'd need to actually slow the aircraft down to a lower speed, say at least 80 knots, and then configure the aircraft accordingly and then make your turn, being very careful how you turn. This is one of the problems. People probably do decide to return or come back, but they end up ploughing to the side of the hill because they've got no space to turn in.
Peer pressure is probably a major issue from pilots. So before you go away on the trip, tell the passengers you mightn't get back on the day that you plan to get back. Have extra time, take extra cash, have a credit card, be prepared to stay an extra 24, 48 hours. If people can't do that, make alternative arrangements to transport back. Most of the regional airports like Mildura, Albury, they all have airlines that they can get on an airline and come home. So King Island, if you're on King Island, the same thing. They have airlines that you can get home. So there's no need to push the issue. And I think if you make that clear before you leave, most people will accept it.
So that's that way of returning to Moorabbin from Kilmore, coming back in that direction to the southeast. But you can also come back to Moorabbin, or if you're going to Bacchus Marsh, for example, doesn't have to be Moorabbin, heading in this direction, which is the southwesterly direction. And you're keeping to the left-hand side of the terrain, and most of the terrain there, of course, is the other part of the Great Divide, and we have Mount Macedon over there on the right-hand side. Coming back this way, it's very important to think about your terrain clearance, obviously, but also your separation from controlled airspace. So now you're going into an area where the steps are stepping down rather than stepping up. You've got to mix the controlled airspace with the terrain and the cloud and what have you. So probably this is not the best option for returning to Moorabbin. The recommended route via Sugarloaf is probably the best way to go. There we make a turn and head down towards the south to Bacchus Marsh Township. We can also go to Melton Township as well. It's just that Bacchus Marsh will take us clear of Melton Aerodrome and also Bacchus Marsh airstrip. As we approach Gisborne, you can see that we're moving the other side of Mount Macedon, and Mount Macedon is fairly obvious over there on the right. If we're going down from Gisborne or Riddell's Creek towards Melton, there's some parts of the terrain there where there's only 300 feet between the control step and the ground, so it's very difficult to fly through that area. And that's usually marked or highlighted by a purple patch showing less than 500 foot separation. This is why we may be better off keeping to this side. We've got more vertical airspace to use, and we're keeping well clear laterally of the control steps.
I think it's important, you've got to understand that Sydney, north and south to about 60 miles, is a basin. It's a flat area, and it's surrounded by mountains in the south, to the west, and to a lesser extent to the north. So we refer to the Sydney Basin as that flat area.
Generally speaking, over the ranges, in the southern part of New South Wales in particular, 40 fogs per annum would be the average you would see in a year, and that's mainly due to the valleys in between the ranges and immediately to the west and the east of the ranges, another favourite area for fog development. Mainly a problem during the winter because it's a lot cooler, it's a lot moister in particular. In summer it's definitely thunderstorms.
Summer season brings quite a bit of instability and developing of thunderstorms. They each develop from the southwest.
We can also, on occasions, get thunderstorms building up out over the ocean and moving along the north-south coastline of New South Wales.
Sometimes in summer there will be a southeasterly change, and that will bring to that Sydney Basin quite a bit of cloud, low cloud and overcast conditions. That's just from all that moisture over the ocean banking up on the other side of the dividing range. So it'll be perfect out here, but it'll be really difficult to get into Bankstown.
Thunderstorms are more likely in the northeastern part of New South Wales, mainly because of the northeasterlies bringing in a lot of the moist, warm, tropical type air, but also because geographically it is quite warmer in the north than it is in the south. That's not to say that other areas of New South Wales can't get thunderstorms, it's just that they're more likely to be severe in the northeast corner. But the ranges all along New South Wales are quite a favourite area for thunderstorm development, and anywhere east of that trough line that we showed is fair game in summer. The Blue Mountains is really tricky, in particular Mount Victoria. The first reason is that we don't have an automatic weather station located directly at Mount Victoria. The nearest one we have is at Mount Boyce, which is just opposite the pass. So the information we get there is not necessarily representative of Mount Victoria. The other thing to take away is that it can be influenced both by the westerlies and by the easterlies.
That strong westerly, which I mentioned when we departed Bathurst, it's coming across here and it will be hitting the side of this range. So this is where you will get a little bit of turbulence. You can see in front that there's a little bit of a light shower, but we can see through that shower, the horizon behind it. So I'm quite happy to continue on. When we get to Katoomba, what we're going to do is start descending. There's a tendency for your speed on your descent to pick up, and you've got quite a high ground speed behind you, and that wind blowing over the top of the hill, you'll get quite a bit of turbulence. Mount Victoria is given on your area forecast as a critical location. 3,700 feet above mean sea level. On that critical location, what they'll do is they'll give you height above mean sea level, but it's a good idea to know that it's 3,700 feet. That's a really good indicator about what sort of cloud is occurring along this Great Dividing Range. As I fly along, I always have a really good look to the south to see sort of what the cloud's doing down to the south, and just looking for options, say on our return. Okay, you've got the Katoomba airstrip just over there. Whilst it's used quite often by the locals, there's in fact quite a bit of wind shear and turbulence. Great to know that it's there as an option, say if the weather really closed in and that you weren't able to get down into this Sydney Basin nor back out to Bathurst or Orange.
To the south of Sydney Basin, Bowral, because whilst it is relatively flat, there's still some high points around that Bowral area.
With Bowral, it's a critical location that allows pilots to travel from the coast across the ranges into the western slopes. Unfortunately, it's not a typical pass or gap through the mountain range. It's actually part of the tableland, so it particularly is influenced by fog during winter and quite prone to fog. We won't put fog on an area forecast though, we'll depict it as cloud on ground.
Options here, say that if you've got a cloud looking, ahead going back, tracking towards Bankstown, and if you couldn't see that horizon, suggestions is to track perhaps towards Wollongong, which is just over that range there, drops away into Wollongong. That's an option. However, if it's a southeasterly stream coming through, what you'll see is probably quite a few clouds, and that will be probably not suitable because of weather associated with that southwesterly. If you got to this stage and could no longer see a horizon, my option would be to go back to Goulburn. As you can see, there's a few high points around Bowral. Bowral itself is quite flat, but there's this hill with the tower on. As you're flying along, I'd be thinking of alternative aerodromes if that closed in ahead. Wollongong, like I said, or just try making it back to Camden. If you're in this position, another option would be landing at Mittagong ALA.
To the north, there's a critical location, Murrurundi, which is just on the edge of the Liverpool Ranges.
Murrurundi is quite a fantastic area, really, to allow passage from west to east through the mountains, because generally speaking, it's not as volatile in terms of the weather in either a westerly or an easterly. It's not prone to the low cloud that Mount Victoria and Bowral are prone to. More often than not, if fog does develop, it's going to be lower than the location of Murrurundi. So depending on the widespread nature of the fog, it might still allow pilots passage through the gap with reference to ground. Of the three, particularly if Mount Victoria is cloud on ground, we would recommend that pilots fly further north and go through Murrurundi instead.
Issues can arise in getting in and out of the Sydney Basin is that you've got Nowra to the south, which is, military control area, and you've got Williamtown to the north. So the options of going coastal, like in some places, it can be difficult given that there's that controlled airspace, unless of course you get airways clearance. If you're in marginal weather, I wouldn't hesitate requesting clearance through those areas due to weather.
Keep in mind that whilst you can technically come down to 500 feet and fly coastal, that make sure you remain over water but within gliding distance back to the land. So watch for a southeasterly change. The other thing is that if it's pushing up against that range there, it will create even greater amount of cloud and you'll find it very difficult, almost impossible to get underneath. Our option would be Wollongong. Keep looking behind to make sure that option still remains open to you. The other alternative would be to continue on, and you'll be then getting fairly close to Sydney control zone, and your option there is Victor 1. Probably the easiest in that circumstance, if it's not looking good ahead, is just go back to Wollongong, have a cup of tea.
Well, we have 4 very distinct seasons. Our winters are certainly quite cold, and spring and autumn are real transitional seasons here. Summer, most people would argue that summer maybe we don't have, but we do have some warm weather. So we do have the 4 distinct seasons.
Seasons are quite different, as in we get a lot of frontal activity in the winter seasons, which we are at the moment. We get a lot of cold fronts with strong winds and cloud and changes coming through.
Winter, we get a lot of rain in the western parts of the state, and spring and autumn. Autumn is very much a foggy time of the year. We get a lot of fogs in autumn, and spring we tend to get showers popping out of virtually anything, and we do tend to have most of our storm activity through summer. It's quite a changeable period.
Heading to and from the mainland or Melbourne, you've got the 2 normal routes. You've either got via King Island or Flinders Island. Flinders Island is normally the pick of the 2 routes. There are a couple of mountains on Flinders Island, but you can obviously go around them, and the weather's normally a lot better on the east.
If the weather is bad, a good option maybe to come via the coast from the north. One of the main things there is obviously remember keep Tassie on your right and the ocean on the left, and head on down towards the south. A good place to enter into Hobart is via Dunalley, and that's quite recognisable by a canal that heads straight through the middle of the city there. The southwest of Tasmania and also the west coast can be quite a nice place to on a very sunny day, but I think on average it's around 300 days a year where they will get rainfall in the western part of Tasmania. So we've left Hobart where it was quite sunny and nice, and we're now heading towards the west, and you can see there's quite a bit of cloud touching the tops of the hills and also blocking a lot of the valleys.
So just because the area forecast that was issued at 6 a.m. in the morning suggested everything was going to be good doesn't mean that at 11 o'clock that's still holding true. So it's really worth updating or getting an update. And the days when it's going to change, you don't quite know, really. It could be a good day that suddenly goes bad, or a bad day that suddenly become good. And we issue an area forecast 4 times a day. We do 9 TAFs. We supply a warning service, SIGMETs, and also airport warnings for Launceston and Hobart Airport. We also have at least one person available 24 hours a day and get clarification of something, or just an over-the-phone briefing.
They say about 2/3 of the year it's raining on the west coast, whereas here on the east coast you can go quite a long time without rain. We get quite strong winds. We're smack bang in the middle of the roaring 40s.
The westerly flow hits the mountains, and we tend to get a lot of mountain wave activity. It's very common on satellite imagery to see mountain waves that extend for miles across the island. We have a rule of thumb here that if the 5,000 foot wind is around 50 knots, that will get turbulence enough to put out a SIGMET, and that would happen 60 times a year, if not more.
Yeah, certainly there are a lot of pilots flying to the southwest because it's quite a nice scenic trip. Around the coast is probably your best option. You can head around that way and you shouldn't have too many troubles. Again, you're flying into the weather. Mountains up around 4,000 to 5,000 feet, and you get quite strong weather patterns through there. Strong winds, you also get cloud.
We're going to try and track up this valley ahead of us here. When you're approaching a valley, you want to try and approach it on a 45-degree angle. That way you've got less space that you need to turn around in case you can't continue on up the valley. In these conditions with a bit of moisture around, you may want to check for carby ice, especially at these cooler temperatures. So just pull your carburetor heat out. You'll see a drop in RPM, just leave it there for a few seconds. There's no change, you're pretty right, and there's no carby ice, and then just turn it back off. Okay, so we're heading up this valley. We can see the cloud base is lowering. It's not looking too good, so we're going to turn out of the valley. What we want to do is slow the aircraft down, so just reduce your power slightly, and also maybe put a stage of flap down if you're within your speed, and then turn the aircraft away from the cloud and the valley. Try not to turn too steeply if not required, because you can, obviously it's going to increase your stall speed and you may lose orientation. So we're now back to about 80 knots. We've reduced our power and our flaps, slowing down. Obviously the slower you are, the smaller the radius of your turn. And as you can see, we're now heading back towards blue sky.
Launceston's very fog prone. The airport gets fog about 45 times a year, and the city about 60 times a year. So they're very fog-prone area, and that's mainly because it's in a very broad valley. There's mountains either side, so there's a lot of drainage flow, moisture drains into the valley, and the proximity of the mountains often means that you end up with a low-level inversion over the top, so sort of trapping moist air in there. Pilots going from the east coast into Launceston or vice versa tend to use a track through the valleys, which of course if there's low cloud around is quite a dangerous route. There's also a little bit of turbulence can be experienced through there in virtually any direction. Fog over the south of the state. Hobart doesn't get fog all that often. We get fog through the city a bit. Hobart Airport only gets fog about 6 times a year. There are fogs in the valleys in and around the Hobart area quite commonly during the cooler months of the year.
Most of western and southwestern Tasmania is what we call Tasmanian tiger country. As you can see, it's quite wooded. There aren't many suitable landing areas in this area, so plan ahead before you do head down this way. Try not to head off with the plan that you may be able to land at an alternate site, i.e. landing aerodrome or filter paddock if the weather's no good, because there aren't too many suitable areas, if any, in this area. It is a designated remote area, so you may not be able to get in contact with air traffic control or the weather services if you do get stuck.
I have a very vivid memory of something that happened to me not long after I got my private licence in the late 60s, early 70s. A fellow that I worked with was involved with a hockey association, and they needed to go from Tamworth to Sydney for a big meeting. And they asked me if I'd fly them down, and I was keen to get some hours, and my fiancée at the time and myself decided that a weekend in Sydney would be good. So we settled on the date, and the day came. The weather wasn't particularly good in the Hunter Valley, and I'd made a decision earlier in the day that we probably shouldn't go. And when I had made contact with these other fellows that were going, they proceeded to put a lot of pressure on me to go because this meeting was very important to them. We delayed the flight for a while, and then eventually I was, I guess, pressured into going. However, it was my decision. Initially the flight proceeded okay, and then as we got into the Hunter Valley, the valley was clogged up with cloud as far as you could see. And so we flew for a while over the top of the cloud. It wasn't improving, and I'd made a decision at that point to turn around and go back. My passengers weren't all that happy with that decision, and again put a lot of pressure on me to proceed. And around about that time, I found a hole in the cloud, and I decided that the best option there would be to go down through this hole and get underneath it and go to Sydney that way. Well, we did that. We went down through the cloud, and then when I got beneath the cloud, I was very surprised to find that there was fog to the ground and virtually nowhere to go. So I initially made a decision that I was going to do a precautionary search landing in a paddock, and then a little voice in my head proceeded to tell me that I might end up being very embarrassed and get into trouble for not making the right decision and so forth. So unwisely, I made the decision to climb back up through the cloud, and I don't know how it took, probably several minutes, but it seemed like several hours. And eventually we got on top of the cloud, and that was it for me. So at that point we turned around, came back, and I consider that I was very lucky to have done that. And I also consider that by comparison these days that I'd had more instrument flying experience with my private licence than they do these days, and it was all in the aeroplane, none in a synthetic trainer. So I guess I was better equipped to handle the situation, However, the decision was totally wrong, and I should never have got myself into that and my passengers into that in the first place. So that's stuck with me for the rest of my life, and I've never made a bad decision like that. At least I've made plenty of bad decisions, but I've never made a bad decision when it comes to weather after that.
Somebody I've known in Europe, you know, who was a very, very good aerobatic pilot, display pilot, well known around Europe. And he was flying a vintage airplane, a Mustang for that, together with his son, which was a very, very accomplished pilot as well, helicopter pilot, rescue operations. You know, I mean, you know, they have thousands of hours of experience, and they wanted to fly from one side of the Alp to the other side of the Alp for an air show. So they obviously wanted to get there. And they flew up this valley in Europe, and then the weather turned, you know, marginal. And so they turned around in the clouds, but they only turned 90 degrees instead of doing a 180 degrees, and they flew straight into the mountain. There was just nothing left, which is amazing, you know, with all this experience in two pilots in an airplane, and they still came to grief, even though, you know, they have all this experience. Just goes to show, really, that one has to be very, very careful when it comes to weather, non-VMC. One just cannot take enough caution for it, yeah.
It was, I think, around about 1998. I was a CASA FOI, flying some line flying duties with SkyWest Airlines, and we studied the meteorology forecast quite carefully, and because of our local knowledge, we took on board, in fact, a significant amount of extra fuel required to do the task, because we could, and we had the passenger loads, but we had plenty of fuel to take on, so we did, luckily for us. And we flew out to, the task was to fly from Perth to Leonora, Laverton and return, at stopping at each place. Well, the weather forecast for Leonora was sky clear, it was Cav OK, as was Laverton. But the situation was a cold front had gone through the day before, and they were forecasting the bad weather to stop somewhere between Norseman, which is south of Kalgoorlie, and Kalgoorlie, and to the north, where we were heading, it was going to be fine, and no cloud. Well, when we got out there to the first stop at Leonora, the weather was, as I described very early, a complete blanket of low cloud, somewhere around about 1,000 feet, tops. And the base, we don't know, because we flew an instrument approach, with an IFR flight obviously being regular public transport. We flew an IFR NDB approach, and the first approach, as I recall, we didn't even hit the top of the cloud. Okay, it was all done in VMC, but the missed approach height was at the top of the cloud. So we said, look, let's give this away. We had plenty of fuel. We'll go to Laverton, which is about 66 track miles further northeast, which is, we expect that to be clear. We went to Laverton, and the same situation greeted us. We did 3 NDB approaches and never got in off all of those, using a lot of our extra fuel to do so, as you can appreciate. And we finally decided that by now the weather should be burning off the cloud. So we went back to Leonora, and we shot another NDB to get into there, didn't make it. By now our ultimate options were disappearing. So we made a further NDB approach and just got visual contact with the runway environments at minima right overhead the aid, and had enough visibility to circle and land the aircraft, and landed on minimum fuel. And what was supposed to be an 1.5-hour flight ended up in nearly 3 hours worth of flying. So it gives you an idea of how the weather forecasting is just that, it's forecasting. It's not necessarily the accurate one. And that was an unusual situation, but it gives you an example of how even IFR aircraft can be caught out there. But if you'd been VFR, you would have been in all sorts of trouble.
I find the best way to deal with a bad situation is I was in Flinders Island on a VFR flight with a few mates, and we had to get back and the weather was no good. I said, let's leave it to the afternoon. We went back to the Flinders Island hotel where we were staying, and the first thing I did was have a beer. And they weren't very happy with me, unfortunately. They were extremely upset, but they didn't care after 3 beers, and we went back the next day.
Runway 35, clear for takeoff.
The sky is overcast and the visibility poor. That reported 8-kilometre visibility looks more like 3, and you can't judge the height of the cloud. Your altimeter says you're at 1,500 feet, but your map tells you there's local terrain as high as 1,200 feet. There might even be a tower nearby, because you're not sure just how far off course you are. But you've flown into worse weather than this, so you press on. You find yourself unconsciously easing back just a bit on the controls to clear those none-too-imaginary towers. With no warning, you're in the soup. You peer so hard into the milky white mist that your eyes hurt. You fight the feeling in your stomach. You swallow, only to find your mouth dry. Now you realize you should have waited for better weather. The meeting was important, but not that important. Somewhere a voice is saying, you should have turned back. You now have 178 seconds to live. Your aircraft feels on an even keel, but your compass turns slowly. You push your rudder pedal and add pressure to the controls to stop the turn, but this feels unnatural, so you quickly return the controls to their original position. That feels better. But now your compass is turning a little faster and your airspeed is increasing slightly. You scan your instrument panel for help, but you don't find any. It all looks unfamiliar. You're sure this is just a bad spot. You'll break out in a few minutes. But you don't have a few minutes. You now have 100 seconds to live. You glance at your altimeter and are shocked to see it unwinding. You're already down to 1,200 feet. Instinctively, you pull back on the controls, but the altimeter still unwinds. The engine is into the red, and the airspeed's almost there too. You have 45 seconds to live. Now you're sweating and shaking. There must be something wrong with the controls. Pulling back only moves that airspeed indicator deep into the red. You can hear the wind tearing at the aircraft. You have 10 seconds to live. Suddenly, you see the ground. The trees rush up at you. You can see the horizon if you turn your head far enough, but it's at an unusual angle. You're almost inverted. You open your mouth to scream.
Several years ago, there was a young aspiring pilot that was building up hours on a around Australia trip, and they were flying from Drossen back into Adelaide, and it was again one of those days where the showers were coming through in rain bands. That stretch that the pilot was flying along was over the St Vincent Gulf. They had a clearance, and as they continued along the clearance, their flight path took them into one of these showers. Unfortunately, as the pilot entered the shower, they would have lost the horizon, and the visibility was probably down as little as 3,000 metres or less. In that case, the pilot tried to turn away, probably still trying to fly visually, and ended up spiralling into the St Vincent Gulf. The tragic bit about those accidents is that the pilot probably left the decision to turn around to the absolute last second. There were gaps, there's always gaps in the rain shower band, so if the pilot was looking further ahead, maybe the pilot could have diverted left or right of track with ATC's approval to manoeuvre around the rain showers. And probably 5 minutes after the accident occurred, the showers clear through and it's actually quite clear. So never sort of leave the decision as to divert around or to even turn back to the last second, because that's how you end up suddenly getting yourself into a situation where you've got no forward visibility, no horizon, and now you're relying on all of your previous training and possibly your instrument flying experience.